Chapter 10 of Frigid Fracas by Maxine Reynolds. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Dale Grothman. The airport nearest to the Grant Memorial Military Reservation was some 10 miles distant from its borders, which, upon the scheduling of a fracas, were closed to all aircraft and to all persons unconnected with the fracas, with the exception only of telecrews and military observers from the Sov world and the Newt world, present to satisfy themselves that weapons of the post-1900 era were not being utilized. The distance, however, wasn't of particular importance. The powered aircraft which would tow Joe Mauser's glider to a suitable altitude preliminary to his riding the air currents, as a bird rides them, would also haul him to a point just short of the military reservation's border. Joe Mauser turned up on the opening day of the fracas, which was scheduled for a period of 1 week, or less, if one or the other of the combatants was able to achieve total victory in such short order. He was accompanied by Fred Soligen, who, for once, was without a crew to help him with his cameras and equipment. Instead, he sweated it out alone, helped only by Max Mance, who was being somewhat huffy about this tele-reporter taking over his position as observer. They approached the sailplane, and while Joe Mauser checked it out in careful detail, Freddie Soligen and Max began loading the equipment into the graceful craft's second seat, immediately behind the pilot. Max growled. "How in the Zen are you going to be able to lift all this weight, Major Sir?" Joe said absently, testing the ailerons. "We'll make it. Freddie isn't any heavier than you are, Max. Besides, this sailplane is a workhorse. I sacrificed glide angle for weight-carrying potential. That meant absolutely nothing to Max Mance, so he took it out by awarding the tele-reporter with a rare combination of glower and sneer." Freddie said, Oh, here they come, Joe." However, he kept his head low, storing away his equipment, and seemingly ignored the approach of the 3 distinctive uniformed officers. Joe said from the side of his mouth, "Get that you-know-what out of sight soonest." He turned as the trio neared, came to attention, and saluted. The foremost of the 3, his tunic so small at the waist that he could only have been wearing a girdle, answered the salute by tapping his swagger stick against the visor of his cap. "Major Mauser," he said in acknowledgment. He made no effort to shake hands, turning instead to his 2 companions. He said, "Lieutenant Colonel Krishnala Majumdar of Bombay. Major Mohammed Kamil of Alexandria. May I introduce the—" There was all but a giggle in his tone. "Celebrated Major Joe Mauser, who has possibly reintroduced aircraft to warfare." Joe saluted and bowed in proper protocol. "Gentlemen, a pleasure." The 2 neutrals responded correctly, then stepped forward to shake his hand. Colonel Lajos Arpad added gently, "Or possibly he has not." Joe looked at him. The Hungarian seemed to make a practice of turning up every time Joe Mauser was about to take off. The Sov-World representative said airily, "It will be up to the International Disarmament Commission to decide upon that when it convenes shortly, will it not?" The Arab major was staring in fascination at the sailplane. He said to Joe, "Major Mauser, you are sure such aircraft were in existence before 1900? It would seem," Joe said definitely, "designed as far back as Leonardo and flown in various countries in the 18th century." He looked at the Hungarian. "Including, so I understand, what was then Tsarist Russia." The Sov-World officer ignored the obvious needling and said merely, "It is quite true that the glider was first flown by an obscure inventor in the Ukraine. However, that is not what particularly interests us today, Major. Perhaps the Commission will find that the use of the glider is permitted for observation. However, it is obvious that before the year 1900, by no stretch of the imagination could it be contended that they were, or could have, been used for, say, bombing." He turned quickly and pointed to Freddie Soligen, who, already seated in the airplane, was watching them, his face not revealing his qualms. "What has that man been hiding within the craft?" Joe said formally, "Gentlemen, may I introduce Freddie Soligen, Category Communications, Subdivision Tele-News, rank Senior Reporter. Mr. Soligen has been assigned to cover the fracas from the air." Freddie looked at the Sov-World officer and said innocently, "Hiding? You mean my portable camera and my power pack and my auxiliary lenses and my—" all right, Arpad snapped. The Hungarian was no fool and obviously smelled something wrong in this atmosphere. He turned to Joe. "I would remind you, Major, that you, as an individual, are responsible for any deviations from the basic universal disarmament pact. You and any of your superiors who can be proven to have had knowledge of such deviation." "I am familiar with the Articles of War, as detailed in the pact," Joe said dryly. "And now, gentlemen, I'm afraid my duty calls me." He bowed stiffly, saluted correctly. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Colonel Majumder. Major Camel, Colonel Arpad, a pleasure to renew acquaintances." They answered his salute, and stared after him as he climbed into the sailplane and signaled to the pilot of the light plane, which was to tow him into the air. Max Mance ran to the tip of one wing, lifted it from the ground, and steadying the glider until the forward motion gave direction and buoyancy. Freddie Soligen growled, "Zen! If they'd known I had a machine gun tucked away in this tripod case." Joe said unhappily, "The Sovs have obviously decided to put up a howl against the use of aircraft in the West World." He shifted his hands on the stick gently, and the glider, which had been sliding along on its single wheel, lifted ever so gently into the air. Joe kept it at an altitude of about 6 feet until the light plane was airborne. Freddie growled, "How come the Hungarians have become so important in the Sov world? I thought it was the Russians who started their whole shooting match." Joe said wryly, "That's something some of the early timers like Stalin didn't figure out when they began moving in on their neighbors. They could have learned a lesson from Hollywood about the Hungarians. What was the old saying? If you've got a Hungarian for a friend, you don't need any enemies?" Freddie laughed, even as he looked apprehensively over the sailplane's side. He said, "Yeah, or that other one. The Hungarians are the only people who can enter a revolving door behind you and come out in front." Joe said, "Well, that's what happened to the Russians." He pointed. "There's the reservation. We'll be cutting from the airplane in a moment now. Listen, were you able to find out who either of General McCord's glider pilots are?" "Yeah," Freddie told him. "Both are captains. One is named Bob Flaubert and the other is Jimmy Hduka." "Bob Flaubert?" Joe growled. "He's an artilleryman. We've been in the drill together half a dozen times." Freddie was staring below, trying to understand the terrain from his perspective. While Joe was tipping the lever which let the tow rope drop away from the glider, the telereporter said, "Both of them used to fly light planes for sport. When you started this new glider angle, they must have seen the possibilities and took it up immediately. But you ought to be able to fly circles around them. They just haven't had the time for experience with planes without motors." "Bob, eh?" Joe said softly. "He saved my life once. 5 minutes later, I saved his." Freddie looked up at him quickly. "Zen," he complained, "this is no time to be thinking of that. So now you're even with him, and you're both hired mercenaries in a fracas." "But I've got a gun and he hasn't," Joe growled. "Good!" Freddie snapped at him. They had cut away from the light plane, and Joe headed for the area which Cogswell had ordered him particularly to keep scanned. Jack Altshuler was a fox in combat. His heavy cavalry had more than once swung a fracas. At the same time, he kept himself alert for other gliders. It seemed probable, since the enemy forces had two, that they would use them in relays, which meant in turn that it was unlikely Joe would find them both in the air at once. In other words, if he attacked the one, possibly shooting it down, then the other would be warned, would mount a gun of its own, and it would no longer be a matter of shooting a clay pigeon. Joe turned to mention this over his shoulder to Freddie Soligen, just in time to catch the shadow above him and behind him. Holy Zen, he snapped, kicking the right rudder, thrusting his stick to the right and forward. What the devil? Freddie protested, looking up from adjusting the lens on his camera. 3 or 4 .30-caliber slugs tore holes in their left wing. The rest of the burst missed completely. Joe dove sharply, gaining speed, winged over, and reached deliberately for altitude. The others were above him. He yelled back at the cameraman, "Put that chut-chut gun together for me. Be ready to hand me pans of ammo. And if you want blood and gore on that tele lens of yours, get going." It still hadn't got through to the smaller man. What in the devil is going on? Joe banked again, grabbing for a current rising along the hill slope, circled, reached for altitude before they could get over to him and make another pass. He snapped bitterly, "Did I say something about poor old Bob Flaubert not having a gun while I did? Well, poor old Bob's obviously got at least as much firepower as we have. Freddie, I'm afraid matters have been pickled." The other was startled. "Do I have to draw a picture?" Joe said. "Look!" He pointed to where the other 2 aircraft circled, possibly 100 meters above and 500 to the right of them. The other 2 gliders bore a single passenger apiece, and were seemingly moving as quietly as Joe and Freddie, but gliders in motion are deceptive. Joe shot a glance at his rate of climb indicator. He was doing all right at 6 meters per second, 1,000 feet a minute, considering his weight. Freddie had at last awakened to the fact that they were in combat, and even that the enemy had drawn first blood. The wound taken in their wing was not serious from Joe's viewpoint, but the torn holes in the fabric were obvious. But the little man had not gained his intrepid reputation as a tele-cameraman without cause. He moved fast, both to get the small French machine gun into Joe's hand and to get himself into action as a cameraman. He snapped, "What's the situation?" Joe, circling, praying for an updraft that wouldn't give out on him before it did on the others, on their opposite hill, said, "We weigh too much. Altitude counts. What have you got back there that can be thrown out?" As he talked, he was shrugging himself out of his leather flying jacket. "Nothing," Freddie said in anguish. "I cut down my equipment to the barest, like you said. You've got extra lenses and stuff. Out with them." Joe tossed his coat over the glider's side, began unlacing his shoes. "And all your clothes. Clothes are heavy." "I need my equipment to get long-range shots, like when one of them crashes." The little man was scanning the others through his viewfinder, even as he argued, and shrugged out of his own jacket. The updraft gave out, and the rate of climb meter began to register a drop. Joe swore and shot a glance at his opponents. Happily, they too had lost their currents. Both were now heading for him. Joe clipped out to his companion. "We're not going to be getting shots of them crashing unless we lose more weight. Overboard with everything you can possibly afford, Freddie. That's an order." There was one thing in his favor. He had a year's flying experience, more than 6 months of it in this very glider. The stick and rudder bar were as though appendages of his body. One flies by the seat of one's pants in a soaring glider, and Joe flew his as though born to it. The others, obviously, were not as yet thoroughly used to engineless craft. He banked away from them, flying as judiciously as possible, begrudging every foot of drop. He could feel the craft jump lightly every time the cursing telereporter jettisoned another article of equipment, his pants or his shoes. The others evidently had their guns fixed mounted, to fire straight ahead. Joe wondered, even as he slid away from them, how they'd managed to escape detection from the Sov-World and Newt-World field observers. Well, that could be worried about later. One of them fired at him at too great a range, and then both, realizing that they were dropping altitude too quickly and that soon Joe would be on their level, turned away and sought a new updraft. As they banked, their faces were clearly discernible. One raised a hand in mock salute. "Look at that curd-loving Bob," Joe laughed grudgingly. "Here, let me have that gun." He steadied the small mitrailleuse on the edge of the cockpit, holding the craft's stick between his knees, and squeezed off a burst which rattled through the other's fuselage without apparent damage. The faux glider slid away quickly, losing precious altitude in the maneuver. "Aha," Joe said wolfishly. "So now they know we've got a stinger too." "I got that," Freddy crowed. "I got it perfectly. Listen, you're too high for the boys down below. Get lower so they can see you on lens, Joe. The other tele teams. Every fracas buff in North America is watching this." Joe snorted his disgust. "I hope every fracas buff in North America chokes on his trank pills," he snarled. "We're in drill, Freddy. Understand? We're too heavy, and there's two of them and one of us. On top of that, those are Maxim guns they've got mounted, not pea shooters like this chut-chut." "That's your side of it," Freddy said, not unhappily. "I got care of the photography. Get closer, Joe. Get closer." Joe had found another light updraft and gained a few 100 feet, but so had the others. They circled. His experience balanced their advantage of lesser weight. Happily, their glide ratios didn't seem to be any better than his own. Had they high-performance gliders of 40 or even 35 gliding angle ratios, he would have been lost. "Nothing else you can toss out?" he growled at Freddy. "What the Zen?" Freddy muttered nastily. "You want me to jump?" "That's an idea," Joe growled wolfishly, even as he circled. "I should have realized when you came to me with your fling about reintroducing aerial warfare that it wasn't an idea that others couldn't have. It's just as easy for Bob to mount a gun as it is for us. Now we're both kept from doing reconnaissance by the other, and—" Joe Mauser broke it off in mid-sentence, and his face blanched. He shot a quick look downward. All three gliders had climbed considerably, and the terrain now was indistinct. Joe snapped, "Hand me those glasses." "What glasses? What's the matter?" Freddy complained. "Try to get closer to them, and let me get a close-up of you giving them a burst." "My binoculars!" Joe snapped urgently. "I want to see what's going on below." "Oh," Freddy said. "I threw them out, along with all the rest of the equipment. Glasses, semaphore flags, that sun blinker you had. All of it went overboard with my extra lenses." The craft was so banked as almost to have the wings perpendicular to Earth. Joe shot an agonized look at the smaller man, then back again to the Earth below, trying desperately to narrow his eyes for keener vision. Freddy said, "What in Zen's the matter with you? What difference does it make what they're doing down below? We're all occupied up here, thanks." "This is a frame-up," Joe growled. "Bob and that other pilot. They weren't out on reconnaissance this morning. They were laying for me. They're out to keep me from seeing what's going on down there. And I know what's going on. Jack Alshilter pulled a fast one. Here we go, Freddy. Hang on." He slapped his flat brake lever with his left hand, winged over, and began dropping like a shot as his gliding angle fell off from 25 to 1 to 10 to 1. In seconds, the other two gliders were after him, riding his tail. Freddy Soligen, his eyes bugging, shot a look of fear at the two trailing aircraft, both of which periodically showed brilliant cherries at their prows. Maxim guns emitting their blessings. The tele-reporter turned desperately back to Joe Mauser, pounding him on the shoulder. His physical fear was secondary to another. "Joe, you're on the lens of every tele team down there, and you're running." "Cut that out," Joe rapped. "Duck your head. Let me train this gun over you. I've got to keep these jokers from shooting off our tail before I can get to the marshal." "The marshal?" Freddy yelled. "You can't get to him anyway. I told you I threw away your semaphore flags, your blinker, everything. This country's hilly. You can't get your message to him anyway. Listen, Joe, you've still got time. You can stunt these things better than those two can. Duck, Joe snarled. He let loose a burst at the pursuing glider over the smaller man's head and just missed his own tail section. They sped down almost to tree level at fantastic speed for a glider. The two enemy craft were hot after them, their guns flacking in continuous excitement, trying to catch Joe in sights as he kicked rudder, right, left, right, in evasive maneuvers. His guess had been correct. The swashbuckling Jack Altshuler had known his many times commander even better than Cogswell had realized. Instead of 3 alternative maneuvers open to the wily cavalryman, he'd ferreted out a fourth, and his full force, hauling mountain guns on muleback with them, were trailing over the supposedly impossible mountain path, which originally could not have been more than a deer track. Freddy Soligen in back was holding his head in his hands in surrender. He could have focused on the troops below, but the desire wasn't in him. Not one fracas buff in 100 could comprehend the complications of combat, the need for adequate reconnaissance, the need for Joe to get through. He made one last plea. Joe, we put everything into this, every share of stock you've accumulated. All I have, too. Don't you realize what you're doing, so far as the buffs are concerned? Those 2 half-trained pilots behind have you on the run. Joe growled. And 20,000 lads down below are depending on me to report on Altshuler's horse. But you can't win anyway. You can't get your message to Cogswell. Joe shot him a wolfish grin. Wanna bet? Ever heard of a crash landing, Freddy? Hang on. The end of Chapter 10 of Frigid Fracas by Mack Reynolds. Recording by Dale Grothman.